William Kennedy once called Albany, New York, an improbable city of political wizards, fearless ethnics, spectacular aristocrats, splendid nobodies, and underrated scoundrels. This was never truer than in the year 1933. Prohibition was coming to a close, the Great Depression was in full force, and a still youthful Democratic machine run by Daniel Patrick O'Connell was already in complete control of day-to-day life. Dan O'Connell, or as he would later be called, the Boss, or Uncle Dan in his later years, began humbly the son to Irish parents in the south end of Albany, and he didn't wait long before he found himself embroiled in politics in 1919 when he challenged the Barnes Republican machine in the city assessor position. Though it took 2 more years for Albany to elect a Democratic mayor in William Hackett, it was apparent that Dan had a knack for politics. It was even clearer at the time of his death in 1977, after nearly 60 years of complete control of one of the longest political machines in the history of America. Like nearly all politicians, Dan was not without his enemies, though, and the year 1933 proved particularly tough. It was in that summer that his nephew John had been kidnapped and held for ransom by local gangsters, causing politics and organized crime to cross chaotic paths. The episode set off a chain of events that landed New York's state capital at the center of national attention in a way it will likely never see again. To understand why the young John O'Connell was kidnapped in the summer of 1933, one must first take a look at his uncles and father, all among the most powerful political brokers of the city at the time, and more commonly referred to as the Albany Democratic political machine.
The Albany Democratic Organization had been in power for quite some time, since they kicked out the old Republican organization, the Barnes people, in the 1920s.
Usually what would happen, there were 19 wards in the city, 3 of them, Cathedral Hill, North Albany, Sheridan Hollow, could be counted on to be Democrat. The rest would all be Republican. That's how strong the organization was. The entire Republican ticket got back. Virtually all of the wards returned Republicans, with the exceptions that I mentioned, and the one person who was running citywide, who was Daniel P. O'Connell. The organization found new life and hope, reorganized so that by 1921 it was a Democratic sweep. By 1931 there wasn't a single Republican left on the Common Council.
Apart from being adept at the political game, the O'Connell family played a crucial role throughout the waxing and waning days of Prohibition. Dan was adamant throughout his lifetime that he never let bootleggers and organized crime come into the city. Instead, he ran the beer through his family business.
The O'Connells and the machine ran the beer, and they brought it from New Jersey mostly. And they told Diamond, when he tried to come in, they said, "You can't come in." And they said, "Absolutely not."
The O'Connell stranglehold on beer during this time period had been challenged many times, with Jack Legs Diamond being the prime example. Diamond came into Albany with a reputation as a hardened gangster who tangled with the likes of Dutch Schultz and Arnold Rothstein. He had but one goal upon arrival in Albany: run the beer.
And get out of town and don't come back. Well, he didn't get out of town. He came back and he stayed here, and that was his last day.
After multiple alleged warnings by people within the machine, Diamond met his untimely end in 1931, the victim of assassination. His likely killers? I asked William Kennedy on his thoughts.
I asked that to Dan, and Dan said Fitzpatrick finished Legs. Those were his exact words. And Fitzpatrick was the fellow who became the chief of police. He was a detective in 1931 when Diamond died. He was a tough detective.
The name Legs Diamond cannot be separated from the kidnapping of 1933. Though he was long gone by the time, it was later made clear that past associates of Diamond, most notably John Oley, would be picked out as some of the masterminds behind John O'Connell's ransom in 1933. Again, beer and politics were the backdrop for the episode.
They really can't say exactly what was about the kidnapping, either trying to get a beer license or for ransom, and I think it was probably both. In the spring of 1933, they knew Prohibition was coming to an end. Everybody wanted a beer license. John Oley and Manny Struhl, they said they wanted to get a beer license, but again, they needed some money real quick.
But I think there was a definite hostility between the Oleys and maybe Struhl, I don't know, but certainly between the Oleys and Percy Geary and the O'Connells, because they couldn't get their foot in the door and bring beer into Albany. And that was a big source of denial.
After one botched kidnapping of a local figure and a Rensselaer County bank robbery that left at least 3 bodies, little loot, and no beer license to show for it, the local gangsters John Oley and Manny Struhl knew they had to act fast to make quick cash. This is precisely when they hatched the plan to kidnap and ransom the youngest male O'Connell.
The kidnapping was big news. It was O'Connell's nephew, Dan O'Connell's nephew, his brother's son, who was, his 20s or 30s.
Dan got the call. They looked, they couldn't find young John. They talked to his fiancée. John had been out that night to the movies with his fiancée, Mary Fahey. And he had just dropped her off and came back to his house when they got him.
John O'Connell Jr., the son of Solly, was the only male descendant of the 4 O'Connell brothers. The kidnapping outfit assumed the politically connected family would pay a hefty sum for his safe return.
I think they thought the O'Connells had a real lot of money. The O'Connells were not poor ultimately, but they were never super rich people.
It was a huge, huge story. It's a newspaper story. They called it the last organized kidnapping ring of the 30s. And I'm not so sure how organized they were. I don't think they were all that organized.
All in all, the kidnappers numbered 10, or at least that's how many were prosecuted when all was said and done. The masterminds were Manny Struhl and John Oley, who along with Oley's brother Francis and Percy Angel-Face Geary made up the local contingent. The patrolling detectives who worked the beat area directly surrounding the kidnapping were Ray Joyce and John Tuffy, both relatively young and with different concepts of the force.
Now, Ray Joyce didn't want to be a policeman, but he did want to work, so he went and he did what he had to do to support his family. He had a partner. His name was John Tuffy. John Tuffy was a cop's cop, took the job very seriously, and they wound up walking the beat, which is what you did in the 1930s, in the south end of the city of Albany. Anyway, the O'Connell kidnapping occurred, and all kinds of questions were asked. Did you see anything unusual, etc., etc.? And they asked Ray Joyce, and Ray hadn't seen anything particularly unusual. Then they asked his partner, John Tuffy, and they said, well, what did you see? Well, he said, I don't know if this has anything to do with it or not. And he reached in his pocket and he pulled out his notebook, because he was one of these police officers who wrote notes on anything unusual or suspicious or just out of the ordinary. He flipped through the pages. He got to the night in question. And so after the kidnapping occurred, I remembered that, and I walked up on 2nd Avenue. And I got to about where that car was parked, and I could look through the backyards, and I could see Johnny O'Connell's house on Putnam Street. And I realized that there was a good possibility that that house was cased out by somebody, perhaps Johnny Oley, and that he could look and see when the light went on when Johnny O'Connell came back. He could also see the pattern that this young couple, who, by the way, eventually married, had a regular courting style, but he would have to be back at a certain hour.
If it wasn't for Tuffy's natural detective ability, a small detail that eventually cracked the case may have escaped into the periphery.
Later on, when they got their heads together, Delaney and Chief Smurl talked about what they had. They also brought in the head of the state police, Mr. Warner, talked about it, and then they had Tuffy's report. They knew with John Ollie's car there, he had to be the prime suspect, but they couldn't tell anybody. They didn't want it to let out.
It is important to remember that the kidnappers were directly corresponding with the O'Connell family through a series of ransom notes. They warned the O'Connells not to have any of their machine friends or the authorities involved, and so publicity of young John's captivity was in short order. John Ollie started the bidding for young O'Connell's life at $250,000, an astronomical price at the time. By way of correspondence did the kidnappers come to another phase of their overall scheme, picking a go-between. The victim family was granted the power to take out coded ads in local papers that denoted a set list of known racketeers and otherwise unsavory types to be the negotiators between them and the kidnappers.
The plan was to have John Ollie to be the go-between. So when Dan actually did call him on the telephone and said, "John, I need your help. This is the situation. Can you help us out to be the go-between?" Well, John had to play coy. He played hard to get. Well, he played too hard.
One thing the kidnappers were not aware of at the time was that the O'Connells were very much in tandem with the local authorities, going so far as to pick a go-between who they suspected was in on the plot.
Dan said, "Okay, what about this other guy, Manny Struhl?" So he chose Manny Struhl. So he calls up Delaney. Dan was secretly working with the police because the note said, if you tell the police, we will kill John. So everything was on the QT.
So this thing went on and on and on, and I think the big mistake these guys made was moving their victim to New Jersey. He went over state lines, got the FBI involved. That was not a good thing to have done, especially remember this is around the same time as the famous Lindbergh kidnapping. So, people were very kidnap sensitive in those years, and it was kind of weird. There was an agreement on a ransom, but that was all set up, and the money was supposed to be transferred in Washington Park. Supposedly, someone went in with a suitcase, and supposedly no one ever left with a suitcase. So there are many people who still believe somewhere in Washington Park there was buried, I think, something like $40,000, which was a lot more then, but still was not a princely amount.
Eventually, the gang and the O'Connells settled on a $40,000 ransom, quite a downsize from their original asking price for the boy's life, but still a reasonable amount given the era.
So finally, they got John back, and on the way back, it's reported that Manny Struhl says, "John, do you know where you were?" John's looking at this guy. Now, John was blindfolded except when they put the bandages around his eyes and tape. Underneath his eyes, he was sweating. It was hot summer night. The sweat loosened the tape underneath his eyes. He could see a little bit. He could describe the room in some detail. So when they released him, driving him back to New York, he's looking at him like, "I've heard that voice. I've seen those shoes. I've seen that hat."
Was he able to see people, could he have recognized anybody? So Leo tried to get that, and Dan said, no, absolutely not. So Leo went to Ed O'Connell, who he was very close friends with, and Ed said, and he said, "Look, I've talked to the district attorney, I've talked to the police chief, I've got a lot of stuff about what was said and what would happen. I can write it myself if you give me the okay. Can I write it Johnny's first person? I know a lot about how they treated him and so on." And Ed said, okay, do it. So he did. And then one of the things he said in the course of writing this was something that apparently Johnny did say, which was that I never saw any of the kidnappers. He was blindfolded, and he was manacled to a bed or tied with ropes or whatever.
Picked as the go-between, Manny Struhl delivered the unmarked bills to the kidnappers and came back with John, and otherwise without a hitch. Looking at the ransom notes were authorities, and they suspected Struhl had drafted at least a few of them based on writing samples from Struhl himself. It wasn't long after returning the young O'Connell from confinement that Struhl found himself in a confinement of his own.
So they arrested Manny Struhl, I think it was around the first week in August. And again, when Manny got arrested, John Oley and crowd hit the streets. They saw it coming.
The trial went on, and he was convicted. That was a trial in Albany County Court, which the political machine controlled. There was a district attorney, and they controlled the grand juries. I mean, and everything was. But it was an open trial, and they convicted him, and then it was appealed. And it was reversed on the basis of the fact that they should have called more newspaper men was one of the points.
In the midst of Struhl's appeals to the court, the FBI manhunt for the Oley brothers and Percy Gary was widening across the country. The three were undaunted by their exposure as known criminals and would be involved in the 1934 armored truck robbery in Brooklyn that raked in over $425,000. Later, the Oleys and Gary took on assumed names, vanishing into the wind.
One night, at some point, the San Francisco police late at night got a call from a guy that was drunk, slurring his name. Says, "I've seen the guy. I know who the guy is." Who? That Oley fellow. In True Detective magazine in 1937, they made a little article, and they had Francis Oley's picture there, the perpetrators. This guy said, "He's my next-door neighbor."
It was after the three Albanians were finally captured that the whole outfit began to drop like flies into the palms of the police.
And then one, by 1937, they picked up 4 years after the kidnapping. They got the four other guys from New Jersey, Harold Crowley and Sonny McGlone, and I can't remember the other guys, but there were several.
John Oley, he was medically paroled in 1959 out of Atlanta and died in 1960. Percy Gehring, again, he was a local mobster, spending most of his life in prison. They were going to parole him. He didn't want to go out. The records I've got from Alcatraz, he pleaded with the people not to parole him. They assumed he couldn't operate in the outside world because obviously being in Alcatraz, they told you exactly what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, and when you're going to do it. Now you're on your own. So he jumped in front of a prison laundry truck and committed suicide.
It was here that a majority of the kidnappers learned the price for stealing a prince. In the end, money, bodies, and various forms of authoritarian manpower were left across the country in an episode that so few cities can claim has ever happened in their history. Though politics and organized crime were the background for one of the biggest kidnapping rings of the 20th century, one cannot deny that they would not exist without one another. Only could the O'Connells, or a family like the O'Connells, demand such attention and action at a national level. Just as politics and organized crime in this kidnapping ring could not exist without each other, neither could the O'Connells and the kidnappers themselves. It was a time of Great Depression and bootlegging was out of style. With a family like the O'Connells, one could either submit to power or risk an independent life in Albany. Just to understand what an independent life in Albany meant, one needn't look any further than the O'Connell kidnapping of 1933.